I'm Eric Anderson. I'm the president of Maris Compost and the project manager for the development of Ferntor Nature Preserve. I'm so excited to share with you our featured event of the evening, a talk by keynote speaker Francis Moore Lappé, Finding Hope Through Democratic Action. This presentation is sponsored by the Campus Sustainability Advisory Committee with support from the Office of Academic Affairs, School of Science, Campus Ministry, and the Student Programming Council. Going around the room will be clipboards with flyers from the Small Planet Institute, a collaborative network Francis helped start that promotes research and education to bring democracy to life. The organization's goal is to further social awareness and political transparency in order to create a more community-led democracy. Francis, or Frankie, is in sum one of the most important environmental authors and activists of our time. In her books, of which there are now 19, she brings together knowledge of world hunger and how it relates to our present system of thin democracy. Her most famous book, Diet for a Small Planet, was published in 1971 and became the basis of environmental vegetarianism. Many attribute it to be one of the most influential pieces of literature during the 70s, inspiring everyone from grassroots activists to one of my personal heroes, Steve Jobs. The book went on to be a bestseller with over 3 million copies sold. Following this success, she co-founded 3 organizations to work towards educating Americans on the environment and democracy: the Institute for Food and Development Policy, the Center for Living Democracy, and the Small Planet Institute. In terms of accomplishments, there seems to be no end to Frankie's incredible list. She has been given several notable awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, the Rachel Carson Award, and the James Beard Humanitarian of the Year. Furthermore, she's been granted 19 honorary doctorates and is the founding counselor of the World Future Council, a member of the International Commission on the Future of Food and Agriculture, and a member of the National Advisory Board of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Today, Frankie travels to universities across the country, spreading her longstanding message of environmental awareness, involvement, and activism. Her latest publication is titled Daring Democracy: Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want, and has received critical acclaim for her call to a democracy movement for the everyday citizen. This book will be available after the presentation for purchase and signage. On behalf of Marist College, I'm so honored to present to you all such an amazing woman. She's truly an inspiration to us all. Please give a round of applause for our distinguished guest, Francis Moore Lappé.
So thank you so much. It has been such a rewarding day. I so appreciate having so much interaction with students who were so stimulating and challenged me with questions. So I, let's see, get my clicker here. This talk is really the direction of my current work, and I'm still exploring it with you tonight. I'm writing a new book, which I will describe. So I'll start by just saying the obvious, that we are alive at a very, very, very rare moment on this planet. It is a very special moment that requires the very best in us. And perhaps we should all feel privileged to be alive in such a moment. So what I mean by this extraordinary time is captured for me in this image. That we all know that sometimes a big storm can uproot the biggest tree and we can see the roots for the first time. For me, that is the moment in which I share with you that we are in extraordinary crisis. And as in a relationship, so as a nation, when we get to solve a problem, it's when we go to the roots. That's required. And so my real thesis throughout this evening and my life's work is that the crisis that I see today has 3, fewer than that, 3 interacting inseparable roots. That one is economic, that we have accepted a rather strange idea that a market, which is such a wonderful mechanism, a market economy driven by essentially one rule, what brings highest return to existing wealth, can end up with positive solutions. Instead, we are now in the almost inconceivable situation where 3 Americans control more wealth than the bottom half of all of us. And that was reported in Forbes. So economically, that this root of extreme inequality is one. The second is the political root, that we have allowed our democracy to be so infused with the power of money that it is broken. That is the second root. And the third is truly represented here, is the climate catastrophe that is threatening life itself. And that we must face then, as Americans, and I didn't know this until very recently, but I guess it makes sense, that counting from the beginning of the industrial era, that the US has contributed more to the creation of the climate crisis than any other nation, and we still contribute, each of us on average, about triple the average greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So we're right at the center of this catastrophe. Now, I want to begin then to ask, how did these interactive roots of our crisis, how did it come about? How is it that we together are creating a world that none of us as individuals would choose? I don't think there are many people on this planet that would choose those three roots. So these 3 roots then are the essence of the issue. And how did we get here? And perhaps the greatest gift of my life happened to me when I was 26. And the world was in deep fear about hunger being inevitable, that we'd overrun the Earth's capacity to feed us, and population bomb, Paul Ehrlich's book of the time, spewing fear throughout the world. We just didn't have enough. And so the greatest gift, in a way, for me is that when I walked into the library and started putting the numbers together, I realized, wait a minute. From a frame of scarcity, we are seeing scarcity. We are actually generating the scarcity we fear. And it began to sink in on me as a very young woman that our minds, the questions we ask, the frames we use, determined whether or not we can solve any problem, determine literally what we can see and what we cannot see. And so I love to quote an expert here. So I will use Albert Einstein. It is theory which decides what we can observe. And he's getting at that in one way. And for me, I can do it in a very homey story. It really happened to me. Not too many Thanksgivings ago, I rushed downstairs to start making my root and vegetable dish that I always make for 35 people coming in the afternoon. And I got very annoyed because the Dutch oven that I always baked these in was missing. And I looked in all the cupboards and looked in the pantry and looked in the basement. I was really annoyed that somebody had borrowed this and not told me. So I started chopping vegetables, still annoyed. But about 15 minutes later, I turn around and guess what? There it is, except that I had put a plant in it. And I was looking for a baking dish, and I don't bake plants. And so I couldn't see it, even though it is big and red, right? And I started laughing, and I said, there you go. Literally, it was right, maybe 4 feet from me. And I couldn't see it because I was not looking for a planter. So we hear the kind of common cliche that believing is seeing. That seeing is believing. And I've come to say, what comes more naturally to me now to say, obviously, is that believing is seeing. That we see the world according to the belief that we hold, the stories that we tell. And so I've really been taken by this idea. And recently I heard that those who tell the story rule the world is a famous saying that is attributed to both the Hopi Indian and to Plato. So I feel it's got to be true. Those who tell the story rule the world. And I think that's what they're getting at, that the story we tell ourselves so frames our understanding. And so what is the story that Americans have absorbed? And this is how I get to these roots, because there is quite a contrast in my lifetime. I compare my lifetime to my children's. I was born in the mid-40s, 44. My children were born in the early 70s. And I just want to capture for you these two framing stories that I grew up with and then my children grew up with. So let's go to the era beginning in the 40s, after the New Deal until the early 70s, that our culture story was that we can do great things together and that government is a partner in fulfilling what our Constitution's preamble calls the duty to, it doesn't use the word duty, but promote the general welfare. That is what we're about, the general welfare, working together. And that was our frame. And so during that period of my growing up, that both Democrats and Republicans, they both acted from that frame. Take Dwight Eisenhower. In 1957, Dwight Eisenhower was the first to pass civil rights legislation and even sent troops to Arkansas to enforce the court decision on desegregation. And then Republican Nixon, too, he saw government as a force for progress in 1970, creating the Environmental Protection Agency and passing the Clean Air Act. And he then once said that this is a time that we can move, that we can really begin to move on problems of clean air and water, a Republican. And then there was a profound change. By the early 70s, those at the pinnacle of our economy got very frightened, very frightened. They felt that the businessman was one of the least influential forces in the country. They were really concerned. And so in 1971, the Chamber of Commerce commissioned, here is the two framing stories. So you can look at that while I'm moving on, sorry. The Chamber of Commerce got very concerned that indeed the corporations were losing their influence. And Lewis Powell, by all accounts, a very nice gentleman, and about to be a Supreme Court Supreme Court justice, was commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce to write guidelines for American business people to how do they defend themselves against this onslaught of attack and negativity. And he was really worried. He wrote, the free enterprise system is in deep trouble and the hour is late. And using violent metaphors of what was against him, broad shotgun was a term he used, rifle attacks, not literally he did not mean, but that was what he was feeling. He was very frightened. And interestingly, in this memo that he writes, invited by the Chamber of Commerce, in this memo, he singles out Ralph Nader as his biggest threat. And what Ralph had done by that time was help champion the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. And later, that measure is attributed to saving 500,000 lives. But Lewis Powell saw him as a great threat. And so he admonished business and to get behind, get very busy in pushing forward throughout our culture how to expand the influence of business. And he was very specific about it. He talked about in the strategy included going from grade school to grad school, as we talk about it in Daring Democracy, creating think tanks and national media that to engaging very actively in creating a new story, one that is distrust government, the free enterprise system is what it's all about. Part of the strategy was the delegitimizing of democracy's norms and institutions. Interestingly, even by the 1980s, then Newt Gingrich, later Speaker of the House, he exhorted his followers to engage in the struggle to protect the free enterprise system, with the savagery and the duration of civil war. Wow. So your opponents are not opponents, they really are your enemies. And of course, he advised, Lewis Powell advised people who had wealth to pool their funds to help coordinate an effort to protect the free enterprise system. And going so far, I just saw recently, of course, one of the families that was motivated by this approach was the Koch family. I just noticed the lengths that they have gone to. Their Heartland Institute once had ads, billboards, they called them online billboards, that linked people who believed in climate science to mass murderers like Charles Manson and Ted Kaczynski. It was very, very extreme action. And one key strategy that followed up on the advice of Lewis Powell was the creation of a grassroots political operation. And I just learned from a scholar at Harvard, Adam and I write about this in Daring Democracy, that now the Koch network is larger than the Koch on-the-ground network around the country is larger than the network of the Republican Party. And also, Lewis Powell said, this requires serious funding and serious coordination of funders. And today, the Koch brothers sponsor twice a year a conflab where the largest donors come together with this worldview and then coordinate their activities. For example, one of the families that is part of this broad network is the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos, now our Secretary of Education. One of the things I learned about the DeVos family, which I didn't know until Adam and I wrote together, was that the DeVos family sponsored paid for the legal firm that then took the case, Citizens United, got all the way to the Supreme Court. That is the same family who now is represented in the Department of Education. So I won't go over on the right side what we call the rigging of the rules, but a very, very clear strategy to increase, for example, the influence of lobbyists, and most striking explosion of lobbying that happened from the time of the Powell memo in '71 till a decade later, that the number of firms with lobbyists in Washington increased 14-fold. And so there was also, as I'm sure you've read about, great success in suppressing voters who might not go along with your strategies of putting business community first, and diluting the votes of those that might disagree with you. Very successful gerrymandering operations. So in all that I've said so far, I just want to be very, very clear. I am not blaming bad or evil people. What I'm talking about is a worldview shift, a worldview shift that has had very real consequences, because this idea that government can't be trusted and that business should prevail as the way to guarantee the well-being of America, that led to what I call then that a very real spiral of powerlessness among many, many citizens. Because if you accept the premise that we are unable to really do democracy because we're too selfish and self-centered and individualistic, that we have to rely on some automatic force, we certainly can't trust ourselves, our neighbors, and we feel that we have to look for some alternative, automatic solution that works on its own without us interfering. And that then came this inordinate trust in a free market that works by itself. That you don't want to look behind the curtain and see what the magician is doing, because it's just better if you leave it alone. And then what happens? As I pointed out earlier, it was one kind of market. It has been highest return to existing wealth, so wealth accrues to wealth, it accrues to wealth, until we reach that extreme level that we are today. And I just want to underscore inequality in the United States. It's not just worse than Western Europe. It's worse than about 100 or more countries in the world. So we are real outliers in this because of this, I believe, this mindset, this story that we've swallowed. And that then what happens? It leads to the increase of experience of scarcity. And then people think, oh, well, see, people are really selfish and greedy, and we really can't do democracy, and really, why bother to vote? And so I'm suggesting that a spiral of powerlessness that is triggered by this worldview of really under distrust of the process of government, denigrating it as a process, making your political opponents into real enemies that you can't even deliberate with, that idea of politics of civil war ends up in creating the spiral of powerlessness. And it has real life consequences. It has real life consequences. This is a really interesting bar chart because on the far, you can see the lowest quintile on the left, and in each of the blue and the red, then the highest of the wealthiest on the right. And you can see that during the period that I grew up, that everybody really gained a lot, and the poor gained the most. And then look at my children's generation from the 70s on, that look what happens, that really only the wealthiest really soar, and the poor gained virtually none at all. So I just want to say that the story that I'm just beginning to outline, I believe is in large part responsible for these very different story in the second period here. So, and these are all numbers before the financial crash, right? They don't really capture how it's gotten worse since then. And on the environment, I just want to underscore again the interacting roots that during the first period, 48 was the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. 1960, President Eisenhower signs, these bills I mentioned, and he put forth the plan of studying air pollution from cars. 1963, the Clean Air Act. 1970, as I said, Richard Nixon creates an EPA. And in the second period, well, the denigration of democracy flowing from this new frame all the way to the Trump administration, ordering 85 rollbacks, the Trump administration, 85 rollbacks in environmental protections, air, water, land protection. 53 of them have been completed. The rest have been resisted so far. And I just want to put that in perspective, that this rollback on protections is our distrust of government intensifies. That I want to point out that most of us are aware of what happened in Flint, Michigan with the water. Actually, there are 5,000 communities across the country that do not meet federal lead standards. So these problems are deep and pervasive and far-reaching. So at a deepest level, I would say that this represents failure. These two periods, one, I'd be much happier in the world that I grew up in than in my children's. I think most people would. But this framing of our human story fails us in another deeper way than just depriving us of growth and income, for sure. And that is that I believe that the dominant frame, this dominant story, really belies the deep human need beyond the physical, the need to have a say, to feel that we have a voice through our democracy. That is what we want to feel, that we count, and that in that counting, our lives have meaning and purpose, and that 3, we are connected to one another in genuine relationships. And so for me, what is really damaging about the dominant story of the last decades is that it denies the very essence of human dignity, and that is the heart of democracy itself. So that's where we've been. And what I'm so excited at age 75 to be alive in is that a new story is being written. A new story that goes beyond what I grew up with and beyond the denigration of democracy that we're living through. And so what is that new story? What is the new story that millions of Americans are helping to bring to life? It goes to this very deep root of dignity itself. It says we can't be sliced up. You know, dignity is dignity. We can't have the vote in a few times, but not have dignity in our economic life, for example. So what I'm suggesting then is that something is happening that may have never happened before. And there is what I am experiencing in one photo. But the idea is that we are in this moment realizing that that democracy is an issue for everyone, not just for people who are, you know, wonks or democracy fixated. In other words, this movement of movements bringing that democracy and the environment movements is represented now by an organization called Democracy Initiative, based in DC, but it represents now about 70 organizations from Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Food and Water Watch, NAACP, Labor, that they represent 45 million Americans. And so they are acting together. They're saying that, you know, yes, my main issue may be the environment if I'm the Sierra Club, but I know I can't solve my organization's problems if I don't have democracy. So they are working together then. And this common focus then on the core democracy solutions is one on voting rights, getting money out of politics, and equal voice through fair districting. So the other thing that they are embodying, in my experience, and we, I should say, are embodying is, I think, this core idea that democracy is not some dull duty that you have to perform out of obligation, but it is being being with others and having the opportunity to express these deep needs for power, meaning, and connection. Energizing. It's not just the dull, sort of bland spinach we have to down to get our real buzz of personal freedoms. No, it is an enlivening way of living, of thinking of ourselves as living Democrats in a way. So it's saying that democracy is who we are. Yes, certainly that we can be cruel and othering, yes, but our species, what distinguishes us over our long, long evolution is that our capacities for empathy, that we're outstanding compared to other primates, that our capacity for joint problem solving, our sense of fairness, even, of course, some other creatures share that with us, but we have a very distinct, you know, you've heard your children say, it's not fair. You know, we have a very distinct commitment to fairness and cooperation. Do you know when they look at our brains when we're cooperating or competing? It's when we're cooperating that pleasure centers light up that are similar to eating chocolate. So we evolved for fairness, cooperation, and empathy if the conditions arise that we create to elicit them from us. And so what are the right conditions? What are the conditions proven to bring out our best? I think for me that's what that question is like, okay, as a species, we're going to grow up and we're going to ask the most basic question. What does history tell us about what are the conditions that bring out the best and the worst in us? And I think it's pretty clear. It may not seem as clear to you, but what are the conditions that bring out the best in us? I would say that there are at least three that are very distinct. They are the theme of the dispersion of power. We know now, again, from psychological studies, that when people have power over others, that their empathy is actually diminished. They can read this in our brainwaves somehow. I don't know how, but it registers that. So dispersion of power brings out the better selves. Transparency. In the UK, a university in the UK, they some of the professors were really annoyed that others weren't paying for their coffee at this honor system coffee service. And so one psychology professor put a photograph of human eyes above the coffee station, and guess what? There was a huge increase in the professors paying for their coffee. So just the thought of somebody watching us makes us behave a little better. So the point is, yes, transparency does wonders. And part of the problem, of course, in the financial crash was that those who were coming up with these risky derivatives and telling us they were really great investments, you know what their slogan was? IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. They knew it wasn't transparent. They knew what they would get out of there with their millions. So transparency, very critical. And finally, and most important in my view, is this theme of mutual accountability. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we look at our history, we look at our whole species evolution, we realize that there is an Achilles heel here, that we tend to, maybe it's from our tribal roots where we were afraid of the opposing tribe, whatever it is, that we tend easily to be told to blame the other guy, as we see today, that blaming, that othering is our Achilles heel. And so the condition that brings out the best in us, this third one, this idea of mutual accountability, is a cultural norm that we have to create. And I'd like you to think of it like this. It's okay to point fingers as long as you come full circle, because in a relational world where we're all connected, as we now know through ecological worldview, then we're all implicated. That even in the financial crisis, right, we can blame the bankers, but where were we when the industry was deregulated? Why weren't we paying attention as citizens? Why wasn't this something that we caught on to and avoided? So no matter what it is, just about all of us can take some measure of accountability. And I think that could go a very long way toward bringing us together in a real democracy. That's why I want to point out that I'm not pointing fingers at evil people, but at a thought system that has created where we are. So we need to then absolutely, as democracy champions, avoid the othering at all costs. But I know some of you might be thinking, yeah, that sounds really good, but aren't we already just too polarized to really come together around foundational questions about how we fund elections and the Green New Deal, for example? Well, look at these numbers. That I think there is so much more unity than we're led to believe, because almost daily on the news we see such division today. But I'll just let you look at those numbers, and it is quite remarkable that there is this much unity around foundational questions. And so that is what gets me up in the morning. That is what really lights my fire right now. That across America, because of this unity, that real advances toward basic fairness and fixing our broken democracy and dealing with the climate crisis are actually underway. This is just a somewhat of a quick kind of summary that I think people can miss because there's so much bad news. Is that just in the midterms alone, this 17 states and cities and one county stepped up with serious democracy reforms. And even before the 2018 election, there was already 3 states, and 2 of them very effectively still have public financing for their elections. And I'll tell you one of the outcomes of that is really remarkable. And the automatic registration, which we know increases registration and voting, that since Oregon passed automatic voter registration first in 2016, first used it then, that registrations went up 4-fold. And since then, 15 states plus DC have approved this approach, automatic voter registration. I can explain it during the discussion if you're interested. And by the way, in 2021, New Yorkers will be able to vote online. That was also agreed to. So another innovation, which you may or may not have heard of that I love, is Seattle, where they voted for democracy vouchers, meaning that every citizen gets 4 $25 vouchers that they can give to whatever candidate they want to so that they feel like they have a stake. And this is with agreement about limiting campaign money going otherwise. But if you accept these vouchers, and so even homeless people, just people can participate because of the voucher system. And another remarkable breakthrough, I love the story of, have you heard, any of you heard of Katie Fahey? She was, what does it say there, in her 20s, when she just got fed up with gerrymandering in Michigan, and she put a notice on Facebook, and before she knew it, she had this soft army of people with her going around the state, and they held town hall meetings in libraries with standing room only about how to fix gerrymandering. And here it just started with one young woman saying, I care enough, let's do something. And it wasn't just we need gerrymandering, but people were working together about exactly how do we design the solution. They were talking to each other about the nitty-gritty of how to succeed in this. And if this was able to pass, there's been pushback on it, but I have confidence with people like that it will continue on. So now let's just a taste of the kinds of things that are going on democracy reforms. I just wanted to remind us that in this 3 roots challenge, how do we take on extreme inequality, broken democracy, and a climate catastrophe all at once? That's in effect what the Green New Deal calls for. And so just to get straight then on what the Green New Deal, just a very, very brief summary. It's about, of course, clean energy. It's about well-paid jobs, and it's about healthy air and water, particularly those who are now most hurt by it. And so I just wanted to tell you about how all that is coming together, everything I've said in this talk in a way, through something that I've just learned about, met via Zoom anyway, met Zoe Maxman, who her story just weaves all my messages together, because Chloe was able to run in her district in southern Maine because of, they call it clean elections, public financing of elections. You've got to get a certain number of contributions, and then you get money from the state to carry out your campaign. She was able to run because of clean elections, and in a Republican district that had virtually never elected a Democrat. And she, at 27, ran in a district that had one of the highest average ages of any district in the entire country. So she had a lot going against her. And she ran very explicitly on a Green New Deal platform. And how did she do it? How did she do it? She did it by very much exactly what I mean by living democracy. She told me the story about how she walked down a dirt road to a trailer home on her campaigning, and the fellow said, no one has ever come to my door before. I think they were afraid. And she talked to him about the Green New Deal, and he ended up being very positive, and she ended up winning with a significant victory, and then led in the state to pass a new Green Deal for Maine that was the only bill that was put forward that the labor movement also got behind in Maine, and was extraordinary success in a very short period of time in the Maine legislature. So I'm just suggesting then that Chloe's experience is what I'm talking about. She was really weaving all the roots of these crises together, and she was benefiting from the fix to our democracy in the term of, in the sense of clean elections. And so I also want to spend just a moment, since I'm known as the author of Diet for a Small Planet, my daughter still is very much a leader in the food movement. I wanted to do a particular shout out on how food and climate change and democracy and all of these are so intertwined. And so I just brought with me this slide just to remind us how important our food system is to solutions to the climate crisis. Many of you may know this, the extent of livestock contributions, 30%. By the way, we only get 17% of our calories from livestock, but they contribute 30%, nearly 30% of greenhouse gases. That 80% to 80% of deforestation, our food system, and 70% of water use. And so on climate and food, I will do a little shout out for my daughter who wrote Diet for a Hot Planet. And she there, it's a stories of what is happening very much in terms of stories of possibility. But key to this is that going away from chemical agriculture is going toward climate solution, because organic agriculture, 1/2 to 2/3 less per acre of greenhouse gas emissions, reducing waste in the food system. I was so struck by the estimate that if food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter. So reducing food waste and enjoying more plant protein as part of what can create a solution to the climate crisis. And so now that I've laid out some of these solutions directions, I want to ask the question, how do we build confidence in our solutions? And I think one way is that we see that we have made progress. We're not, without, and that we can continue. I also think that it's really important to keep in mind that that we can learn from the Europeans, and that already see how much we've done in terms of jobs in clean energy, and that there are some really surprising success stories. I was just blown away to discover that Texas, where I grew up, and I think of as oil country, that it has so led the way in wind energy that it is now the 5th largest wind energy. It would be, if it were a country, the 5th largest producer of wind energy in the world. And this came about beginning under the George Bush administration, as he was the governor of Texas. And the beauty of this in terms of people's income and addressing climate change is in West Texas, that farmers can lease a small piece of their land to a wind turbine operator and get some steady income. And so I read recently that the farmers out there call wind turbines, they call them a drought-resistant crop. So their income is leveled out. And so there's the economic benefit for farmers that is right tied into the solution to climate change. So it's so important to me that then we stay motivated and understanding that citizens across the country are pushing for legislation. Illinois, for example, Illinois, after 2 years of organizing and a month after Trump was elected, passed Solar for All, massively expanding solar installations that will create 7,000 new jobs and save people there almost $900 a year. And so I really see that this is really moving forward. And New York Renews. How many of you have heard of New York Renews? Because this is another inspiration to me, that New York Renews is a coalition of 150 New York organizations that have backed the Climate and Community Protection Act, that would have the highest standards in the nation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it is really focused on particularly protecting those most disadvantaged and most historically hurt by climate catastrophe. And so what I'm suggesting then is that these begin to create a new story that make possible a spiral of empowerment. Because such stories, whether it's Chloe or whether it's New York Renews or whether it's Texas Wind, we start to realize that in fact, that we can make this work, we can make the decisions together, that we can create values around which the market can thrive and we humans and life on Earth can thrive. That's possible, and we're doing it. And just as we do that, and especially with these democracy reforms like clean elections, then you begin to say, oh yeah, we can get money out of politics, and that can then have a positive reinforcement, because then more positive measures take place, like Maine Green New Deal, that then we begin to say, well, maybe we can let go of some of our fear and blaming, and that it really does work to work together. And so I really believe that this shift from the spiral of disempowerment to the spiral of empowerment is all about our engaging with one another in this movement for democracy, that then we can unite no matter what our environmental issue, our racial justice and economic justice agenda. We can unite in that way for serious democracy reforms as we work for transforming our climate. Now, in closing, I want to talk a little bit differently about what is most required of us right now. Because often, growing up, we're taught that goodness is really the priority. We should be good people. We should be considerate people. We should be thoughtful people. And while all that, of course, stands, I think this special moment that you and I are privileged to be in calls for something much more. That I'm saying that we have this intensely social nature. I believe that very much, that we're not just radical individualists at all, that we seek and want connection so much, but it's also our danger. Our greatest strength, our social nature, is also our liability, because it means that it's so hard for us to speak up and to be different and to take a stand if we think we might get criticized or lose a friendship or alienate our family. So I'm suggesting that we really need to work on, and I'm speaking to myself certainly more than anyone, of course, to build our courage to do that which we thought we could not do. And this is the time when so many people are pushing themselves out of their comfort zones. In my case, it's kind of silly now that I look back on it, but that slide you saw from me in the beginning where I have my, at the end of that march, honestly, I didn't think I could walk 10 miles, and I marched over 100 for democracy reforms. And as a result, the exhilaration and the way that my needs for power, meaning, and connection were met, because I made friends with people I never would have met otherwise. I began to, as we walked into the Capitol that day, I started bawling when I saw the Capitol dome, because I had this realization I'd never had before. I said, wait, those guys in there, they work for me, and I had that sense of power. So the meaning and power and connection as we do what we thought we could not do, even something as relatively simple as a physical feat. But I'm suggesting then that this is really where we are now, that means doing that which we thought we could not do, and transforming then our fear energy into power. That fear is just pure energy. And I had this instance once where I was in a situation where I was like you, in a row with all my good friends, and actually it was Al Gore speaking. And I really disagreed with something that he had not said. And I was thinking, I've got to raise my hand because he's not really grappling with what I think he should. And I was so scared that I would alienate my friends because it was like a collective bow, to Al Gore. And so my heart was just going bum, 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 like that. And in that moment, I said, okay, you always talk about reframing. What's the reframe here? So my reframe is, and I will share my cheesy little trick, is I reframe the pounding heart as inner applause. And it worked, and I got my hand up. Al Gore didn't call on me, but hey, I got my hand up. And so for me then, it is this extraordinary time to, and how do we become more courageous? Well, we're social creatures, that's a big clue. We hang out with people who are more risk takers, who are braver than we, more courageous than we, and that will rub off. And so choose your friends well and try something that you know scares you and makes your heart beat faster. So the good thing then is that I'm saying here about our nature is that courage is contagious. So you can bet if you do something, your kids are going to be watching, your friends are going to be watching, your parents are going to be watching, and maybe they will think, oh, I could do something in this extraordinary moment of opportunity to dig to these roots. I could do something I didn't think I could do. So the beauty of, or what I would say keeps me going more than anything about this ecological worldview that I'm talking about, this where we're all connected and therefore we're all implicated, and that change is the only constant. In such a world, I've discovered that it is simply not possible to know what's possible. So I've given up on the idea of optimism. That's silly. We don't need to be optimistic. All human beings need is to sense that there is at least a probability, however small, that our actions could make a difference, and we'll go for it. We know in life when we're protecting something dear, a child, or in any emergency, if we think there's any chance, we will do it. We will do it regardless. And now our whole planet needs us to operate from that premise. It's not possible to know what's possible, so let's just go for it. And so I declare myself not an optimist, I am a dyed-in-the-wool possibilist. And what I'm suggesting then is that a good way to do that, for me anyway, at my age, is to look back and keep a short list of all the things that have happened that I was given almost zero chance of ever happening. I just mentioned that I grew up, I was a child during the McCarthy era, and it had a terrible impact on my family's church. We almost lost the church. And 12 years later, I'm being paid by the federal government in the war on poverty to fight poverty. So we went from government as this frightening witch hunt, and then a dozen years later, very much we reduced poverty by 42% in a little over a decade through the war on poverty. So, I keep these things in my head that I would have believed to be absolutely impossible until they happened. So I suggest that that's sort of a useful technique. So I will leave you with this and a short poem that captures possibility for me. So I want to leave you with that freedom, that since it's not possible to know what's possible, we are free. And then the words of a beautiful poet, Denise Levertov. It's called Beginners. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We've only begun to imagine justice and mercy. We've only begun to envision how it might be to live as sibling with beast and flower, no longer as oppressor. We've only begun to know the power that is ours if we join our solitudes in a communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. Thank you.